James, I'm a longtime fan, so thank you for coming on today to have a fun chat.
Thank you. It's a real privilege to be here.
So, I followed your work for a long time and love some of the work you've done both in the sporting world, but also taking that to the quote unquote knowledge worker, if you will. And given just what I know about this audience, I'm really happy we're going to have this conversation today. But I want to start with just you and your background. So I know you have some background in sport, and there's a whole journey there that brought you to where you are today. And so maybe we can touch on just sort of some of that sporting background and what got you really interested in performance science.
Well, thanks for that question, Boomer. It's a good one, and it's something I sometimes ponder it myself and say, how did I end up here? And I feel like I've got quite a coherent narrative now, but I don't know whether I'm just post-rationalizing. But I'll kind of share it with you, kind of.
I do that all the time, so it's okay.
Because it's all going to sound completely logical now, but it didn't always feel like that. But one thing that I think has always been true and consistent is I feel like I've had a guiding question in my mind for as long as I can remember. And that question, I would summarize it now as, what does it take to be the best we can be? And for as long as I can remember, I've been fascinated with that. And so I actually spent a few years living in North America when I was a kid with my dad's job. And I remember kind of being 3 years old watching space shuttle launches. And I was obsessed with space. I wanted to be an astronaut. I was obsessed with astronauts. They just epitomized the best we can be for kind of a 4-year-old kid. And so I've always been fascinated with that question and explored it kind of in my own life as well. For me, the kind of one expression of that was in sport. And I wasn't a particularly talented athlete by any stretch of the imagination, but I, at a young age, kind of being a kind of very young teenager, stumbled across this obscure sport called inline speed skating. And because I was always terrible at football, I was rubbish at team sports. And I just kind of put myself in a box. I said, I'm not good at sport, but I stumbled across this sports, inline speed skating sport. I found I was actually quite good at it. And I ended up kind of representing Great Britain on the national team, which wasn't as great as it sounds. It wasn't that hard to get on the team, if I'm really honest. But got to travel around Europe as a teenager and got some pretty good results in the end, and was in some really fun competitions. And it was during that process that I started to figure out what it took to start a journey of becoming the best you can be. And sport is a fantastic domain for that because it is measurable, it's quantifiable. And so I'd summarize that process that I started to formulate as a teenager in 4 steps. I started by establishing where I wanted to be eventually. And when I was first doing this sport in speed skating, it was kind of win a medal at that time at the European Championships. Didn't achieve it, but that's what I wanted to do. The second step is I always wanted to be as clear as possible about where I was starting from to try and evaluate that. Then I'd break down the steps that were required to get to where I want to be. And then the fourth step is probably the most important one. Is I didn't articulate it like this at the time as a young teenager, but I'd always be trying to put feedback mechanisms in place to evaluate my progress and adjust. And so in speed skating, I was progressing. I could see results improving, times changing. But I started to realize quite early on, I really didn't have the right phenotype. I didn't have the right body type to be a great inline speed skater. I had too many slow twitch muscle fibers. Mm-hmm. And I was trying so hard to counter that. So I was spending a lot of time in the gym, in the weight room, kind of doing strength and conditioning training, kind of on my own, just trying to read books, trying to figure it out. This is like pre-millennium. This is before the year 2000. I'm aging myself now. And this old guy in the gym used to kind of say hi and sometimes he'd give me some advice about my lifts and things like that. And then one day he was like, what are you training for? Because you're here like pretty much every day. And I was like, well, I'm trying to get to be a good inline speed skater. And he says, you don't look like a speed skater. He said, you look like a cyclist. I was like, all right, and I was like, why do you think that? And looking back, I was this scrawny teenager, lifting probably 40 kilos on the squat, and obviously I wasn't going to be a super kind of fast twitch speed skater. So he said, well, if you ever think about trying cycling, give me a call. It turns out this guy named Jeff Cook had been the national team track cycling sprint coach, but he'd also worked with a lot of road cyclists over the years. And sure enough, he was true to his word. I kind of said, when I evaluated my progress, it wasn't happening. I thought maybe cycling is the sport for me. And this time I was probably about 16. So I gave this guy a call and I said, I'd really like to try cycling. I'd really like to get good. And I didn't tell him at the time, but I'd already done a bit of thinking and I figured that this could be a 7-year project. So I was 16 and I thought, can I become a professional cyclist by the time I'm 23? That was kind of the idea I had in my head.
How did you arrive at 7 years? Was that just sort of an arbitrary number, or
well,
did you break it down like you did before?
Yeah, I break it down because the way that professional cycling or cycling is categorized is until you're 23, it's broken down. So you've kind of got youth categories and whatever. It starts to get more serious when you're in a junior category, which is up to 18. And then the proving ground where you figure out whether you've got what it takes is called the espoir category, which is in French for hope, which is under 23 racing. And so my logic was I was 16. I had about a year and a half left as a junior. And when I was 18, I'd be in the under 23 category, and I had kind of a few years to try and figure out whether I could make it. Now the crazy thing is at this point, like, I'd never even ridden a road bike. But anyway, I got one. I got a road bike. I borrowed one, got a track bike, and from day one decided I was going to be a professional cyclist. So, 6 months later, I was in the junior national, the national track championships, riding the Pursuit. First time I'd ever ridden a track bike in the national championships, and
wow,
it was terrible. I finished 11th or something like that. Didn't really know what I was doing. I'd never even ridden on the velodrome before. It was just ridiculous, but I did it. So it was a steep learning curve. Initially with a local team when I was 18, and turned in this under 23 category. I joined a national level junior team. And then I started to get more structured in my training, measuring speed and distance, and heart rate was about the limit at that point because power meters were too expensive. Mm-hmm. And basically I was saying, for a given route, am I getting faster? And I was getting faster. I started to win a few races. Started to understand how to structure my training better. So when I was 19, I moved to France to race full-time, initially for a regional team. It wasn't really full-time, had a job in a hotel to pay some bills. But I was there because back in the day, if you wanted to be a good cyclist, you had to move to the continent. There wasn't really a pathway in England where I was living at the time. And I think a pivotal moment for me was when I got my first power meter. I'm sure many of your listeners will be familiar with the technology to measure essentially the mechanical work that you're doing on the bike. Mm-hmm. And it's fantastic because it's so measurable, because then it gave me this kind of normative data set. So I knew some professional riders. I knew a few of them who had power meters. They were very forward thinkers. And I'd asked them to share their data with me. So I knew what it would take to be a pro. And then I looked at where I was starting from. I broke down and I understood what kind of progression I would have to achieve to get to be a professional cyclist. So I started to progress, and eventually I got a ride on an elite under 23 team, and that was linked with a professional team called Brioche de Boulanger at the time. I was starting to make a bit of money through that, so I could actually race full-time properly and really start to invest in my progression. And I was controlling my diet, and I was kind of getting super skinny, and I was trying to get more powerful. And I was using every legitimate kind of legal means to try and improve my performance. The whole illegal side of it, I didn't dabble in. That's another story. I encountered it. One of my teammates got busted. He was my housemate, and we all got arrested in
was it an erythropoietin kind of thing, or something else?
Well, I think from what I know, he ended up going to prison for a little bit of time.
Oh, wow.
It was kind of lighter than that. It was kind of, it was testosterone and cortisone, I think. Okay. There's what he had. I understand. I'm not sure what was proven in the end. But anyway, I wasn't going to go down that path. It wasn't part of my experiment. I hadn't pre-registered those methods. But suffice to say, this is a long way of saying that I realized I wasn't a very good cyclist. And I realized I wasn't going to make it to be a decent pro by the time I was in my final year of an under 23. I had some conversations with people about maybe getting some like contracts with a small pro team, and they were just conversations. It was clear I was never going to be great, but I'd learned a lot, and I'd actually discovered that I really enjoyed this process of breaking down the requirements of understanding how you could become the best you can be in cycling. And I've actually started to help people informally along the way, because people saw this skinny guy from England turn up in France and progress relatively quickly. It didn't feel quickly to me at the time. I was always thinking about what I wasn't achieving, but actually my progression looking back was very good. So I decided to go back to university. I studied sports science at a university in the UK called Loughborough, which is quite well known
Quite
for
famous for
sport
that.
and exercise
Yeah.
science.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then subsequently set up my own coaching business, and applied the same process to the people I worked with. I worked with some elites, some professionals, but the vast majority of the people in my coaching business were amateurs who had incredibly demanding jobs. And so, but this time I was establishing where they wanted to be. I was trying to be as clear as possible about where they were starting from, breaking down the steps that they needed to get to where they wanted to be, and put those feedback mechanisms in place to evaluate their progress and adjust. But this was another pivotal moment, because I realized I didn't have the feedback mechanisms to evaluate or consider how to adjust and structure what was going on in their working life. And what was going on in their working life was probably having the biggest impact of anything on their physical performance,
Mm-hmm.
whether it was psychological stress, whether it was jet lag, whether it was simply just not having the time or the focus to be able to engage with the training. And as I looked around, I felt that a lot of the tools that were there and frameworks didn't really fit the purpose, in terms of trying to create this integrated model for the people I was working with, of combining demanding working life with quite demanding physical training.
Mm-hmm.
So I started to apply tools and frameworks from sports science. Models like polarized training, for example,
Mm-hmm.
to try and understand working life, and in particular knowledge work. So work where people think for a living, because all the clients I worked with were, they were management consultants and finance professionals, and they worked in technology. Their brain was their resource.
Mm-hmm.
And it led me to start to conceptualize knowledge work as a cognitive endurance activity, in a similar way as cycling is a physical endurance activity. And really that point was the catalyst for the majority of my work and research to this day. And so that is how I ended up kind of on this path, inspired by my background in sport. And as I said, it all sounds very linear now, and maybe some of it was, but at the time, it certainly didn't feel like that.
Very cool, and thank you for sharing. It's very interesting to see somebody who can take sort of a far-reaching goal and break it down into really easily actionable steps, and just the methods by which to use are fascinating to me. I want to come back to mentors a little bit later, but when we start talking about knowledge work, and I've had the pleasure of doing this in my own life, but also trying to do it with others as well. When we look at just knowledge work, and you mentioned some of these measuring tools, and I think it is becoming easier with many of these quantified self devices, but how do you look at, or I guess, let's kind of break down the problems that a typical knowledge worker has first, and then we'll kind of get into the different measurement steps that you use. So when you're working with somebody, you mentioned management consultants, perhaps some of my former banker types, but how would you classify or just sort of look at their workday and say, these are the obstacles that these people face?
Mm. So, I mean, one thing that you've probably gathered about me, if you kind of is I quite like models and frameworks, and so when I was trying to ask that question, I think you posed a very good question. How do you actually understand some of the challenges and problems and tackle those problems in knowledge work? And I came up with a framework that seemed to, or was a heuristic device that seemed to describe what was going on. Because the problem is, as you said, we've got some tools to measure what is going on in the brain. But you've got EEG, for example, and even though the temporal resolution of EEG is great, we've got great time series data, and we can see what's happening second to second. Then, unfortunately, we don't really know what parts of the brain really, really precisely are doing what, when, and how they're interacting.
Mm-hmm.
We can have high resolution, kind of in terms of spatially, but then we lose the temporal resolution. So the tools aren't really there yet. We can look at some of the outcomes in terms of the type of work we're doing, what we're achieving. and that can help. But again, it's fuzzy because in knowledge work, maybe I think about an idea for a new strategy for a company that I'm working with, for example, where I see maybe an integration premium by kind of putting together this company and this technology and say you should work together to do this. I might just think about that for 3 weeks and then put it together in a proposal in the space of an hour and a half. How do I measure that? How do I measure that thinking and processing that went on relative to this very focused work that I might have done in 90 minutes to actually generate that proposal for that client? And so once I started to think about this, I said, really, we can probably characterize the work that we do in different dimensions, or it's got different characteristics. So we say there's a characteristic related to the level of focus or the intensity of the focus associated with the work that we do. There's an aspect or a characteristic related to the complexity of the work that we do. There's an aspect related to how much we switch during that time between different tasks. And there's an aspect related to the time pressure that we feel like we're under. And actually, you can use those characteristics or those dimensions and measure them with self-report tools. Things like the NASA TLX, for example, that's got something called the cognitive task load model. And the NASA TLX has been used in a lot of human factors research to make sure astronauts don't get overloaded on space shuttles. I think they failed. If you've ever looked at a space shuttle kind of dashboard, that thing was going to be overwhelming for anyone. But anyway, so I looked at that and that inspired me, this cognitive task load model. And I came up with a heuristic to think about some of the challenges knowledge workers face and what to do about them. And I describe it as cognitive gears. And so you can think about these cognitive gears as 3 zones or 3 types of work. But they're analogous to the kind of 3 zones, the 3 broad zones that you might use for physical endurance training. And so if I think about a knowledge worker's day or my day, I'd think about how much time they spent in each of these cognitive gears. So there's a high cognitive gear, which is akin to high intensity intervals in a workout. Mm-hmm. And 3 features characterize this high cognitive gear. The work is demanding, it's complex, and it requires sustained focus. So that would be me writing that proposal for that client. Mm-hmm. There's a low cognitive gear, and that represents time spent resting, recovering, but perhaps also just mulling over ideas at low intensity. Maybe when you go for a walk and these ideas are just flowing around, or you're in the shower just pondering on something. That's obviously really valuable. And that was like the kind of pondering I did when I was thinking about the integration premium. How can I put these things together for the client? Mm-hmm. Then there's this middle cognitive gear, and that represents menial tasks, switching work. And when you're doing emails and you're doing phone calls and you're doing short meetings, and it's necessary. It's a necessary part of many knowledge workers' days. But if I looked at a knowledge worker's day, and one of the tools I'd often use was just get people to show me their calendar. And if they didn't keep their calendar in a very structured way, I'd encourage them to do that for a period of time. Mm-hmm. Is that this middle cognitive gear really dominated people's waking hours. It wasn't just the conventional work day. It was almost from the moment they woke up in the morning to just before they went to bed at night. Menial tasks and switching work with this high cognitive gear. If it ever appeared, it was very brief periods, which were very difficult to protect. And this low cognitive gear was often almost non-existent. There was very little time for this kind of reflective thinking and recovery. And so one of the ways that I've tried to counter that and tackle that is help people to identify this challenge, that the middle gear is swamping our conscious hours, and to get more structured and to be more structured and proactive about prioritizing protecting time for high gear work at the right time, really being deliberate about this low cognitive gear time for rest, reflection, and recovery is the way I talk about it. And then just you can't eliminate it, but minimize this middle gear, which is taking over. And anecdotally, at least, I found personally and with people that I've worked with, that heuristic provides a tool to maybe identify some of the challenges in knowledge work and maybe start to think about, if we've got the luxury to do that, structuring our days with a bit more intentionality and in a way that I think can represent some general principles about how our brain and body work, which perhaps we could talk about as well.
Mm-hmm. Why don't we, because I would like to go into this, because this sort of model, you portray it well in your book, is sort of very similar to those 3 training modes that you do physically. But so I've been fascinated by productivity for a long time. And I think there's a somewhat of a danger in that world when you get into the weeds, that everybody follows Parkinson's law and we're all just sort of pomodoroing our days to the point where you just end up, you'll have one good day and then six bad days afterwards. And so
Mm,
if you don't mind, I would love to just kind of break down some of those. You mentioned helping people identify where this middle part is taking over. I mean, obviously,
mm,
email is one, but is it a matter of measuring the amount of screen time on their phone, where they go on their browser, all of that stuff? We can just start to break that down. That'd be really helpful.
mm. So I think, I mean, one of the most helpful, the most helpful tools initially are objective. And so if you're an Office 365 user, I often encourage people to just turn on workplace analytics if they've not done that, and just spend a period of time being deliberate about structuring your calendar and recording things in your calendar. Because I think sometimes we trick ourselves and we about what's actually going on because we don't record it. And so one of the simplest tools is just spend a couple of weeks and actually diarize, or even if you do it after the event, record when you are recovering, record that time that you were focused, and then take a step back, extract that data, something like workplace analytics, and just say, how much focus time did you have? How many emails did you respond to? How many meetings did you have? And actually come up with a kind of your own dashboard to describe that. That's probably one of the most helpful tools. But then I'll try and integrate it and with other data sources as well. So I'd start to say, so this is what is going on. This is kind of your starting point. How are you responding to that? So how does that, are there patterns associated with your sleep, for example? So use some kind of wearable device, or you can even use a log, a sleep log. I'm pretty sure 80% of the people here on this podcast, listen to this, are using a wearable, but you can just use
Probably.
a sleep log and they're okay. So use some kind of wearable. I'm a big fan of, I've got several wearable devices I use, but I think measuring your sleep, recognizing that there's some limitations in accuracy, but is there an association between the number of meetings you have in a day and how you sleep? Is there an association with your heart rate variability average during the night, for example? Then start putting in overlaying data about the workouts that you're doing, and how that's maybe having an influence. Where is the correlation there? Use some kind of journal feature, like I've used the Streaks app periodically to measure different behaviors, and start to look at kind of if you're doing breathing exercises, for example, or some kind of meditation. And it is kind of stuff that I'm sure people are doing on this podcast already who are listening to it, but building up a data set that says, where are you now? And then starting to identify kind of the different things that could be improved. But I think that the most important step, though, is once you've done that, to just pick one thing that you're going to work on. Because I think that the challenge that you described a moment ago, which is this kind of sense that we have these perfect days followed by kind of all these rubbish days. Sometimes I see that can be a result of as feeling like we need to optimize everything and ending up optimizing nothing.
Yeah.
And so this again goes back to a principle in athletic training, in sports training, in periodization. So there's all kinds of debates around periodization, but essentially the fundamental principle behind it recognizes that it is impossible to optimally adapt or build every capacity simultaneously. And actually there's a case for prioritizing specific capacities and building those capacities at different times. So maybe there's a period focused on building aerobic capacity. Maybe there's a period with a greater emphasis on anaerobic capacity. Maybe there's a period focused on muscular strength or force development or whatever. And so I often encourage people to say, okay, we've established now that there's 30 different things you need to do. You need to allocate more time for focus, protect it, switch off notifications, whatever. You need to improve your sleep. You need to reduce the number of meetings. In particular, often one of the things I see consistently is, and I've seen this in some data from my academic research, that there's a quite strong relationship between the time that you finish your last meeting and the time you try to go to sleep, obviously, and what type of thinking you do during that time. So something else we could talk about, whether that thinking is problem-solving pondering or what we call work-related rumination, this perseverative thinking where we struggle to switch off. But when you've evaluated all these, then I'd rank them and I'd say, okay, in terms of where you want to be eventually, what do we need to build first? Not necessarily about what you think is most important, but maybe what's going to have the biggest effect. Also, maybe what things can you do now that are going to make the next things easier? Obviously, we talk about sleep all the time. That pretty much always ends up being the thing if people are not sleeping
Yeah.
enough. But break it down and get clear about prioritization. One of the you probably, I don't know if anyone on your podcast has talked about this before. I'm sure they have, but there's a phenomenon known as the Zeigarnik effect,
Mm-hmm.
and
Can you explain that a little bit for everybody?
yeah, sure. So this is one of the kind of theories which can help to explain why we find it difficult to prioritize because everything feels important. It can also help to explain acutely why we can find it challenging to focus on one task because we're so aware of the other things that we need to do.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, our brains are vulnerable to certain situations that can make it more difficult to prioritize, plan, and focus. And the Zeigarnik effect is a way of describing this vulnerability. So it was named originally after this Soviet psychologist called Bluma Zeigarnik, and it describes this experience that we have of continuing to think about a task when we have started it, but we're unable to finish it. And so there's some theories around the Zeigarnik effect that suggest that it might also be responsible for tying up cognitive resources. And so there's been some studies which indicate that people do worse on a brainstorming task if they're prevented from finishing a simple warm-up task beforehand, because that unfinished warm-up task seems to be clogging up their active memory. So in contrast, our cognitive resources are liberated and performance seems to be improved if participants in that study example were able to plan to complete that unfinished task later. But the study makes some interesting points that are relevant here. And one of those points is that those plans needed to be highly specific for them to be successful in eliminating thoughts of unfulfilled goals. Mm-hmm. So when I've kind of done that process and we thought about, here's the 50 things that you need to do to optimize your life, create some specific plans, but accept that you're not going to do them all straight away. Some of these might be things that you do down the line. And again, start to think about this optimization process like an athlete. I know I need to build strength, but right immediately I need to start with endurance. So I'm going to build this endurance base first, for example. That might not be right, but it might be. The point being that you prioritize something, but there will be a specific plan about how you're going to develop your strength later. And it seems to just quieten the brain to free us from that Zeigarnik effect. And there's various tools that I use in practice in terms of that specific planning process, mm-hmm. Which I can share. But that's kind of tactically how I'd start to think about that process of breaking it down.
Well, let's play a little game of choose your own destiny here. I want to pick your brain on those tools because obviously people are listening to this and we have a number of people on the show, and I know myself, I've been guilty of this in the past, that kind of have in their mind that they could do everything at once. And we, may have this training system that we think can create anti-fragility or whatever it is, right? And as you said, periodization is probably the better path. So one path that you can choose is the tools first. And then I want to kind of go into the tactics that you mentioned earlier around that period, because sleep, stress, and nutrition are the three top issues of people listening to the show. And mm-hmm. So that period between last meeting and bed, I want to go a little bit deeper there too. So James, the floor is yours. Which way do you want to go first?
Well, can't we do everything? I would just contradict everything I
said. Well said. I think that was like a good volleyball. I mean, it is the Olympics right now, so that was a good bump set spike right there. So nice job.
Yeah. Well, I think there's probably a way to maybe link them together and think about this. And so we can maybe talk about some Zeigarnik effect eliminating tactics. We can maybe then shift into thinking about maybe some focus techniques. And then talk about how you switch off. And one of the things that I found, so those areas that you just described, around wanting to optimize performance, trying to deal with stress, thinking about how we eat, struggling to get to sleep because you're thinking about what to eat and how stressed you are and how to optimize your performance. I can certainly relate to that. And so it'd be nice if we can maybe try and blend them. But if I was to sum up one phrase that resonates with me and seems to resonate with quite a few people who experience this, is if there's one thing that I think many of us would like to experience, it would be a greater capacity to switch on when we need to and switch off when we want to. But the interesting thing is, and getting a sense of kind of understanding your listeners, the switching on part often isn't the problem. It's the switching off when we want to, that switch off on demand. But I do think that the two are really inseparably linked. I mean, I think to zoom in quickly and just say, how can we free ourselves from the Zeigarnik effect? I'll probably say there's three primary tools that I would suggest people use to do that. And one is ancient, but it's sometimes overlooked because it's been around for so long. And it's the importance urgency matrix from Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I won't go into great detail about that. Google it, you'll find it. And it's just a really practical way to start to take all those tasks and actually take them out of your head and think clearly about what is most important, what's urgent, and what maybe do you just need to kind of minimize those distractions, interruptions. The second tool is another matrix, and it's the action priority matrix. And essentially, it's a way to operationalize the Pareto principle, or the 80-20 rule, because it can help you to differentiate between the menial tasks which need to be checked off your list so they don't become a distraction, with the tasks which bring real results and should be protected from distraction and interruptions. So the action priority matrix. And again, I think people can probably find it, but if not, happy to share it. Where essentially you've got effort on the x-axis, you've got impact on the y, and you've got quadrants then of quick wins, major projects, fill-ins, thankless tasks. Mm-hmm. So they're just 2 really practical tools. And the final thing is just a variation on a question I posed a moment ago, where just consistently asking yourself, what is the most important thing that you can do today that will make tomorrow better? And really just structuring your time and energy in service of that goal, so that you're making these consistent improvements over time. But it's a clarifying question. So they're kind of some of the tools that I would use. I mean, I'm happy to kind of zoom in a bit more and say kind of how would I optimize that focus time, maybe the switching on time. Mm-hmm. Then maybe we can talk about how do you switch off. But I'll pause and take a breath in case there's anything that you want to kind of reflect on or respond to.
So that's beautiful in terms of just giving people here tactical, actionable models really to follow in order to implement these kind of things. Now, identifying the optimal focus time, which I think is where you're going here. There's certain people, myself, I tend to be much more of a morning person. And so first thing, wake up, meditate, go, has worked well for me. But for those who haven't really spent as much time thinking about, or maybe have spent so much time in that sort of middle gear that they don't even know what their optimal time is anymore, how do you work through that with somebody? Because we have all these tools, genetics testing, which may or may not be useful. We can probably even get 24-hour cortisol levels on people and start using that as a tool. But how would you break that down?
Well, I try to keep it really simple. I mean, I think those tools are fantastic and they can be really useful. But often what I'll say to people is, if hopefully there's a time that you can remember where you had a vacation or a holiday, as we call it in England. And during that time, if you had a holiday, ideally a couple of weeks, I encourage people to just reflect back and think and remember how they felt. And so what kind of rhythms emerged when they didn't have the external pressures of work in particular? Did they become more of a morning person or more of an evening person, or in somewhere in between? Because very often that rhythm that you describe, that preference for morningness or eveningness, often is driven as much by what's going on in our environment as it is by our own body clock, our own circadian rhythm. So I encourage people first to start to think about that. What happens when those external pressures are removed? And often you'll find that people's real circadian rhythm, their chronotype, which describes that tendency towards morningness or evenness, will start to emerge. And then I'll encourage people to say, are there ways that you can start to structure your time and how you deploy your energy in normal life outside of holidays, which are in service of that chronotype and more aligned with that tendency? So that's one piece of it. The other thing that I'll do is really get people to think about their light exposure, because in industrialized societies, our body clock has often been completely screwed up. often driven by the fact that the light exposure that we get indoors is so low in terms of measurement of lux. It's often less than 10,000 lux indoors, and significantly less than that relative to the outdoors. And so we've become desynchronized with these natural cues in our environment. So I'd also say to people, start to prioritize some bright light exposure, ideally from outside, within the first 2 hours of waking. And use that as a way to start to re-entrain your circadian rhythm, whatever that is. Even when it's re-entrained, you will, it's retrained again, or realigned, sorry, is probably a better phrase to use. When it's realigned, you will, people still probably have a tendency towards morningness or eveningness, but at least you've got a sense of what that is. So the first step, what's natural for you, kind of what happens when you realign in terms of getting some light exposure at the right time, also minimizing that light exposure later on. But then finally, just once you've done that, start to just pay attention to your energy levels. And generally what we'll find is a lot of people do experience a peak maybe 2 to 4 hours after they wake up, which often relates to kind of 4 to 6 hours after kind of a temperature minimum in their circadian rhythm, which they will have experienced while sleeping. But so about 20% but only about 20% of people are what we call a more extreme morning type, according to the evidence, which sounds like you might be in that category, that kind of meditate, ready to go. Seems like about 20% of people are this slightly more extreme late type. They will feel kind of groggy all day and really start to wake up later on. Everyone else seems somewhere in between. But what I encourage people to do is when they've done that finally is to start to try and characterize their days with another heuristic. And that's just to simply divide their day into 3 periods, a peak, a valley, and a rebound. And the order of that will depend on your chronotype. So if you're more of a morning type, you've got that morning tendency, even if it's not extreme, you'll probably go peak, valley, rebound. If you're more of a late type, you'll probably start the day with that valley, then go into the rebound, and then have your peak later on. But accept that those 3 phases have distinct characteristics, that regardless of when it occurs, the peak is likely to be the best time for that high focus productive work. That valley is going to be the best time probably for that low gear rest reflection. And then that rebound is going to be a great time probably for the kind of the menial tasks and the switching work. Because so you do high gear with the peak, low gear with the valley, middle gear with the rebound. And there's some evidence to support this as well, because in the rebound phase at that part of the day, it seems that our cognitive inhibition reduces. So we're more likely to be distracted anyway. So synchronizing the switching tasks with that rebound in your day, whether that's in the morning for the late types or at the end of the day for the early types, seems to help people to start to synchronize those patterns and get a bit more out of their day.
So if we were to, this is really, really helpful, by the way. And the whole study of biological rhythms has fascinated me for a long time. Now, if we were to overlay this with physical training, because ultimately that's going to have an impact on your ability to perform in the workplace as well, how are we to look at placing physical training within that structure of peak, valley, and sort of that ramp up time at the end? If I'm, let's say, an extreme morning person, do I just put it dent in the middle of my valley because I'm not really functioning that well anyway? Or how should I look at that?
So I really encourage people, and I try and do this myself, to zoom out first, because I think that one of the big challenges, again, for people who want to be high performers, who want to be really physically fit, to be performing at work, to have great relationships, is we fall back into that trap of trying to do everything all the time. And so the tendency is, people say, James, tell me the perfect time to exercise every day, forever. And it's impossible, because what happens when kind of work gets really busy, or a kid gets sick, or you have to take your dog to the vets or whatever, well, what happens is life gets in the way every time. And as you described yourself, you have a perfect day, I'm crushing the world, and then it all falls apart and you just feel like you're a terrible person who just fails at everything. And it just creates this angst. And I've been there. I was there last week, actually. And so I encourage people to say, okay, this level of consistency is impossible. We've got to accept variation, and we've got to go back to that kind of periodized model. And so what I'll say to people is, you're always going to experience this peak, this valley, and this rebound. But what you do in that peak, valley, and rebound is going to change over time. And so with fitness, for example, we know that if you can synchronize your training with kind of the period of your day, it's often driven by circadian phase, but where kind of your body temperature is at its highest, and particularly for strength training, you're going to lift heavier, you're going to move faster, and that's a great thing. The peak for physical training then might be the afternoon for some people, and it might be that you've got some difficult work projects to do. You've got a series of meetings at that time. Unfortunately, it's impossible. But what I'd encourage people to do is I look at their calendar in the long term and say, what do I need to emphasize at different points? So maybe exercise, you do feel at your best in the morning for exercise, but it's not possible all the time. Look at your calendar and say, okay, there's a period of time now where I've got 4 weeks after this really demanding project has come to an end, before the next one really starts to ramp up. I'm really going to focus on this 4 weeks of really and putting a lot in the tank, really trying to build my physical fitness. So I'm going to choose to dedicate during this 4 weeks a portion of my peak time to physical training, to really try and build my physical fitness. There's another period of time where you might say it's going to be really demanding at work, and you've got a lot of deadlines, you're trying to finalize a project. You probably need to dedicate that peak time then to your cognitive work and basically just fit physical exercise in whenever you can. And when you do fit it in, accept that it shouldn't be that intense probably. Because what I often see kind of with high performers is because we're trying to fit everything in all the time, often what we end up doing is massively overloading our sympathetic nervous system. We're basically completely overloading on stress, physical stress and mental stress. And the two are completely interlinked. You can't separate them out. We'd love to be able to separate our mind and our body. And I think, the Greek philosophy that informs a lot of our worldview in the West, I think lends itself to this kind of idea that we can separate them out, but we can't. And evidence has demonstrated in training, in sports science, that when we experience very high levels of stress, not only do we, psychological stress, not only do we not adapt as effectively to physical training, we're actually more at risk of injury at the same time. So I see all these people, and I do this myself sometimes, work incredibly hard in their working life, in their knowledge work, trying to still kind of, keep their fitness and beating themselves up because, their session, they're not completing the workout of the day to the level and intensity they hoped. And they end every day just feeling like, I failed. I didn't quite get the work done that I wanted to. My training session was terrible. Like now I can't sleep and, it's going to like kill me because, I read a book and like my brain's going to start to melt away into Alzheimer's, when I'm 42. I just take a step back, just look at the big picture and just say, this block is going to have to be about work. But this block can be a bit more about my fitness. And day to day, think about how do you need to structure your time to prioritize that thing that matters most? So on average, if you look back at your kind of 12 months, you can say, on average, I tick the boxes 80% of the time. And that will mean over time, from year to year, you're going to start to work towards those goals. That is the path. So going back to that model that I described at the very beginning, where you start to say, where do I want to be? Be very clear about where you're starting now, which isn't going to be where you want to be. When you break down those steps to actually get there, you can't create a perfect routine that's going to be the same every day to achieve that. There's going to have to be phases with different emphases, which are going to reflect your priorities, what's most important at a given time. And I've found, personally, but also from people that I've worked with, that longer term view is quite liberating. Because you're not just pursued by this continual sense of not being good enough. You actually recognize that you're going to achieve it, but it's going to take some time. And it creates a bit more margin, a bit more freedom as a result of that. So, hopefully that answers your question to some extent, but that's kind of how I'd think about it.
No, I love that. And the way you encourage flexibility, because there is this tendency, and I'm guilty of this, right? Like the type A person who wants to overschedule everything, including their morning routine. And then the moment some shit gets thrown in there, it's like, oh, wow, my day's over. And so thank you for talking a little bit about that flexibility. Now, I want to go to the end of the day because there's something you alluded to earlier that you're researching now about meetings and then that process before going to bed and the ultimate impact on bed. So again, predominantly business people, entrepreneur types listening to this, and sleep is a huge issue. We know that globally now. What does that end of day process, well, we kind of know how it looks in a lot of people, but what would be more optimal, if you will?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's another model, a body of research that I find really helpful when we think about what is going on after work, and it relates to it's called work-related rumination, and actually there's a questionnaire that was developed by someone called Professor Mark Cropley, the work-related rumination questionnaire, and he identified three factors in relation to work-related rumination. So there's affective rumination, problem-solving pondering, and detachment, which is kind of just being able to switch off. So it's really interesting actually, because when you everyone thinks, just need to detach, just need to switch off. But when you look at detachment, the people who switch off completely, there's actually quite a strong association between people who switch off and actually lower work performance. And this isn't true for everyone. I know some incredibly high performers who can just switch off and sleep like babies. They just don't worry at all. But my experience has been that a lot of people who are quite high performers really struggle to switch off, and they wish they could switch off completely, but they can't. But actually, maybe that's not a bad thing. It seems that one of the strongest predictors of kind of either negative stress anxiety or an ability to kind of still sleep well and perform well seems to be whether you're in this affective rumination camp or the problem-solving pondering camp. And so after work, particularly once we start to get into the evening before sleep, a lot of the problems seem to revolve around this affective rumination, this perseverative thinking about work. There might even be an association in terms of our executive function here, in terms of an inability to switch from these work-related thoughts to something else. So quite a lot of what I've been thinking about and what I've tried to put into practice is to try and equip people with some tools to switch from the affective rumination to more problem-solving pondering, which seems to be a bit healthier. And one of the ways I characterize this is that it's about switching emotion to action a lot of the time. And so again, there's a framework that I've used to try and operationalize this. And it's not peer reviewed, it's not evidence based. It's just a kind of coaching framework that seems to help me sometimes, and has helped some other people. Even though the work related rumination research has obviously got a great evidence base behind it. And there's 3 steps to this process to switch the affective rumination to the problem solving pondering. And the first step is to do what I'd say is identify sticky thoughts. So often we experience this affective rumination and we struggle to switch off because of thoughts that are associated with emotions. And these emotional thoughts seem to be particularly kind of sticky. And so the most emotionally sticky thoughts often seem to revolve around, or you could reduce them to what I call a why-related thought or a why-related question. So you find yourself repeatedly thinking, why don't I ever manage to finish this? Or why am I always the one who has to take responsibility? And we experience some unpleasant emotions that are associated with that. And we feel stressed and we struggle to switch off. So the first step is to just notice and identify those thoughts and perhaps even take the time to write them down. And for many people, that is quite powerful, that process of writing down, why does so-and-so always do this? Or why do I always think that? The second step is to try and shift that emotion to action, because if we can do that, it starts to take away the power that's associated with it and actually switches into more of a problem-solving pondering. The third step is to do that. And again, often I encourage people to write this down, but over time, this just becomes a kind of mental model which you embed and can start to activate when you need it, even if you don't need a pen and paper. But initially, I do encourage people to use a pen and paper. The step really involves just writing down that why thought, which you've probably already done, followed by a specific how action, which you can put into practice, even if you're not going to put that action into place straight away. So for example, if you keep thinking, why am I always the one who has to take responsibility? Then you would write a note, maybe reminding yourself to schedule a time to speak with your team about how responsibilities are being allocated tomorrow. And so again, you're leveraging some of those principles I mentioned earlier in relation to the Zeigarnik effect. You're creating a specific plan, you're probably freeing some cognitive resources. A lot of these effects, we're often talking about the same thing, maybe from slightly different angles, this inability to switch off. So switch affective rumination to problem-solving pondering with that, what I'd call that why to how process, seems to help people to start to detach. The other thing you can do is simply to increase the amount of time between your final meeting or your final engagement with some kind of work-related technology and the time that you go to bed. that seems to help. But the third thing relates to another framework, and this was driven by a kind of concept which ended up being kind of synthesized in a questionnaire called the Recovery Experiences Questionnaire that characterizes 4 different recovery experiences. So it describes detachment, again, where we forget about work, we distance ourselves from work; relaxation, where cognitive load drops and we actually physically change our posture and relax; mastery related activities, where you learn new things, you seek out new challenges that are unrelated to work, where your horizons are broadened; and control, where you actually get a sense that whatever you're doing, you feel like you're getting to decide to do that. Someone else isn't imposing their schedule on you. So I find that this combination of a tactic to try and identify the why related thoughts or those emotive thoughts and switch them to actions, so identify specific plans, and then kind of doing a mental checklist and saying, during that time towards the end of the day, am I ticking kind of 1 or 2 or maybe more of those recovery experiences boxes? Am I physically distancing myself and detaching from work? That might mean closing the door on your office and locking it and kind of hanging up the key, which is something that I've tried to get into the practice of doing, particularly since I've not been traveling and I've been working from home for the last year. Secondly, have you physically changed your posture? So sometimes I fall into the trap at the end of the day of, I'm like, oh, I'll finish work now. And I just stay on my computer, just tapping away. Maybe I'll watch some stupid YouTube videos or something. I think I'm relaxing, but I'm still in that same posture. I haven't changed. And it's amazing. It's so intuitive, but sometimes we need checklists to remind ourselves to do these things. I go downstairs and actually sit on a chair and put my legs up. And that change in posture, even better if you can lie down, that has a really significant impact on your nervous system, on your physiology, in terms of helping that parasympathetic brake to start to slow down the sympathetic nervous system. Mastery is a great tool. It's the reason why hobbies are so powerful, but also it's why it's so harmful when we get too busy and hobbies go out the window. Learn new things, do something new. I've started to learn to play golf recently. I'm terrible at golf. I'm a really, really late starter.
Me too. Me too.
I'm really enjoying the process. I'm having some lessons. It's useless. There's no reason really for me to learn to play golf for my professional life. Maybe I'll have some meetings or something one day. I don't know. I'm doing it because I'm learning a new skill and it's really fun. And I don't think about work. And when I've played a little bit of golf, I've gone to the driving range, I've hit 50 balls and they've gone all over the place. I actually feel really refreshed. It's not mastery, but maybe I'm on a path to achieving something, maybe approaching mastery in 10 years' time. Finally, control. If I've gone to the driving range, I've done it because I wanted to, not because someone told me to. So they're just some tools, and I think there's a good evidence base to support them fundamentally, and tactics that I'd encourage people maybe to try to actually start to switch off, or at least switch into a more helpful mode of thinking at the end of the day, which is something that I think many of us really, really struggle with, me included.
So what do you, in a particular situation where a person just either owns their own business and feels like they can't shut off, or they just love what they do so much that their work is their hobby in many ways? Is there any model in this case for interjecting? Would you, in that case, interject the hobby with that somebody, or would you allow it to flow freely as it is? I'm just curious because I run into these types of people all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most, you can never get someone to do what they don't want to do, and I try not to be too prescriptive, kind of in the way I approach kind of coaching, working with people. I kind of say, here are some models, here are some ideas, try it out, see if it works for you. And I think one of the things that's clear in high performers, whether it's someone running their own business, for example, an entrepreneur, very successful executive, even like a professional athlete, is there is a special energy that's driving them, and normal kind of ways of approaching life and work don't really apply. And one of the most unhelpful concepts, I think, for pretty much anybody, but particularly high performers, is this idea of balance, that we can achieve this state of perfect equilibrium. I think the energy that's driving a lot of high performers is passion. And there's actually a really interesting body of research around passion. And one of the most helpful models that I've found in relation to this passion research characterizes passion as either harmonious or obsessive. And I can send some links to that if you're interested. And there's actually a scale, kind of a psychological scale that you can do to measure your tendency towards obsessive or harmonious passion. And what I generally find in high performers, and what I found when I start to kind of go off the deep end in my own life and work, is when that harmonious passion starts to become obsessive. Because when passion is harmonious, you can do that really hard work, but somehow it's energizing and you enjoy it. And so if someone is in that harmonious state where they're putting in huge hours and doing massive amounts of work, but they're seeing great results and they're really enjoying it, what I'd often say is, if it's not broke, don't fix it. But just be aware of the fact that this passion that you're using is a really powerful force. It's like Star Wars, it's a powerful force. It's got a dark side, and if harmonious passion is kind of the light side of the force, obsessive passion is the dark side, and we're all at risk of tipping over there. So I'd encourage people initially. I wouldn't interject. I wouldn't say, "Oh, you really need to start working on this great project that's kind of super profitable and really fulfilling, and you need to go and pick a new hobby." It's just crazy. But I would perhaps interject if someone started to recognize that they were tipping into that obsessive passion, that actually they weren't feeling so energized anymore. One of the number one characteristics or warning signs that you're tipping into obsessive passion is that you experience what I call rigid persistence. You keep going because you feel like you have to keep going. You keep going because you're really scared that if you stop, something bad will happen. And the problem is that that actually ends up being a self-fulfilling prophecy. Often you keep going because you fear that something bad will happen, and because you keep going, something bad does happen. We end up with kind of burnout, or even just being so exhausted that you have to take some extended time off and before you can recover. So it's when you start to see the warning signs of that kind of obsessive passion that I'd kind of try and encourage people to intervene for themselves. But at the same time, though, I do find that one of the greatest risks for many of us is we often think we're immune. We think we're the special case. Yeah. And there's a real, and so sometimes I think about hobbies increasingly as similar to prehabilitation or prehab for athletes. Athletes hate prehab. Like everyone knows, like we need to be doing something for our rotator cuff, right? Even if you kind of, you've got to do something. I do anyway. You've probably got your own thing you have to do, especially as we start to get a bit older. And it's boring. It's like, there's nothing wrong with my shoulder. Why do I need to do these stupid exercises with this little band? I just want to smash it, just want to do some cleans, get me in the gym. But hobbies and things like this, they're like the prehabilitation for a cognitive high performer. And it's part of this mindset shift of seeing rest as productive. It's a shame we shouldn't have to. It would be really nice, wouldn't it, if we were like, my sense of self-worth is so complete and I deserve to rest. And for some people that works really well, and I've heard people say that it doesn't really work for me. It's probably because underneath it all, I'm probably an insecure overachiever. But I have to rest by telling myself rest is productive. This is my prehabilitation for my cognitive high performance. And it's awful, isn't it? But it seems to work for me, and it works for some of the people that I work with as well.
Well said. Well said. James, I want to kind of bring things to a close here with a couple of rapid fire questions, but one question that I've wanted to ask you, and I really ask a lot of our guests, is what role have mentors played in your development as performance scientist and what you're doing today?
It's been huge. The mentors and key people and good friends have played an absolutely critical role. There's no way I'll be doing all these interesting things and have these opportunities without them. I'm happy to name a few people if that's kind of
go for it. If you want to give them a shout out, go for it.
Yeah, there's quite a few. One of the early ones was because I'm very interested in nutrition as well, and I was an undergraduate studying sports science, and I was obsessed with supplementation, because I tried lots of different supplements when I was cycling to try and improve my performance. And there was one professor in particular called Ron Morn. You can Google him, Professor Ron Morn, very well-known nutritional researcher or nutritional or scientist, and he never really taught undergraduates, but he occasionally did, and he taught one of our undergraduate lectures. And afterwards, I kind of was in the queue of people to go and speak with him with their geeky questions, while everyone else went and had a beer probably. And I was like, Ron, I was like, I asked him some question. I can't remember what obscure supplement I asked his opinion on, but he basically said, if it works, it's probably banned. And that really stuck with me
Wow.
because I realized that he was probably right, and there's a general principle which underlie that, and it really forced me to take a much more simplified approach, I think, to thinking about nutrition, but also thinking about training more generally, and that idea of he had such a deep understanding, but he really did keep things quite simple in terms of the advice he gave, and so that really it was. I've only ever had like a couple of interactions with him that really stuck with me. The other person who's someone else who wouldn't remember me, I think, but it was someone called Dr. Inigo San Milan. And I first met Dr. Inigo back in
Does a lot of work.
2006 when
He's Colorado State, right?
exactly, yeah.
Okay.
So he's originally from Spain. When I met him in 2006, he was working as a physiologist and doctor at the Sonia Deval professional cycling team. I'd just stopped racing a year before, and I was speaking to him, and in the conversation, something that he said really resonated with me. And because I'd been dieting a lot, I was really skinny. I was about 63 kilos, and
Wow.
I'd struggled a lot with that, with overtraining in hindsight. But he wasn't talking about me. He was talking about the cyclist he worked with, and he was one of the best physiologists, and he's actually coached the most recent Tour de France winner as well. He knows what he's talking about. He said many cyclists diet too much, and he talked about how they have these hypercaloric diets. They don't eat enough calories to fuel the work. And in his view, he said it was better that riders have a better diet, and that he would prefer a rider to be a kilogram overweight, and a kilogram in professional cycling terms is massive, but he preferred them to be a kilo over with strength than underweight.
Mhm.
And the conversation I had with him got me thinking about the fact that, in sport initially, there's probably a way to combine health and performance. And that idea that we can combine health and performance and they actually don't need to be in conflict with each other really stuck with me. There's another person, Professor Stephen Saylor, who is responsible for a lot of the work around polarized training as a physiologist. And I'd encourage you to look at this polarized training intensity distribution, this idea that we spend a relatively large amount of time at this low intensity with smaller focus time at high intensity, and really minimize time in this middle zone. That really got me thinking. I saw the benefits in my own training and others physiologically, and it really got me thinking about, is there a general principle here that could be applied to cognitive work too? And there's loads and loads of people I could talk about. There's a guy called Professor Olivier Houllier, not a very well-known neuroscience publicly. I met him when he was at the World Economic Forum. He's global head of health strategy. He's got hundreds of papers to his name, but his main interest is in measuring the gap between intention and action, what we think
Wow.
we do and what we actually do.
Mhm.
That's huge, isn't it?
That's just such an
And
interesting field. Like, how do you even? I mean, it's a massive field to study, but like, how do you even? I don't know. I wouldn't even know how to go about doing that in some cases, but that's pretty fascinating.
that's the challenge with that question is what has led to all kinds of interesting conversations. And we're actually working together now at a company called Optivio. But Olivier played a really fundamental role in forcing me to think clearly about the limits and the opportunities in measurement tools, as well as like the interplay between physiology, anatomy, biology, our brains, and then how we interact with the world. So he's continues to be a really key influence. A guy called Professor Stephen Lockley, who's a professor of sleep and circadian rhythm at Harvard, really
Mhm.
informed a lot of the thinking I've shared today around kind of when we're at our best and circadian rhythm and chronotype. I mentioned Professor Mark Cropley, and finally there's a guy called Dr. Aki Hintzer, who founded a company called Hintzer Performance, and he gave me this job kind of back in 2015. I don't work with the company anymore, but he gave me a job with the company, this human high performance company, and with this fantastic broad canvas and resources to pursue my curiosity and creativity in this world of human well-being and performance. So I really need to give a shout out to him. So I could keep going. I won't in the interest of time. All these people probably haven't heard of these people, maybe not interested, but they're really fantastic people who've had a huge influence on me. So really wanted to name them.
Well, I'll link to all of these people in the show notes because I know a number of them, and of course the ones that I don't know, I'm gonna go and do a little bit of Google searching afterwards. But uh, two final just rapid fire questions for you, James. When you really need to focus, like really just tap in, what's your go-to? Do you have any tools that you use in particular? Uh, perhaps I don't know if you're in the supplement. Well, you just mentioned your supplement story, but do you use supplements? Like, what do you use to really focus?
Mm. So I think, I mean, that supplement wise, you can't beat caffeine. There's some been brilliant studies that show that like
Yeah.
caffeine is actually has been shown to be as potent and effective as modafinil, which is quite a popular smart drug. And so yeah, I use supplements, but it's mainly caffeine. It's pretty simple. The other one, this is going to be really boring, I'm afraid. It's hydration. So even pretty small amounts of hydration significantly impact cognitive performance. So that's that's another one. The other one is actually glucose. Now, obviously, health-wise, ideally we want to avoid big spikes in our blood sugar. It's been associated with kind of increased risk of metabolic disease, even in healthy people. However, there's this transient effect associated with increasing blood glucose acutely that boosts cognitive performance. If I really need to boost my cognitive performance, potentially at the detriment to my long-term metabolic health, can't beat kind of about 20 to even 50 grams of carbohydrate, of sugar. Just neck it with some caffeine. And I think about it the same way as I would if I was racing. So when I was cycling, I used to use energy drinks. They were terrible for my health, but they made me go faster. And this is kind of the same thing for cognitive work. So that's kind of the nutritional stack. And then obviously, with the kind of my environment is huge. And again, it's simple. It's about turning stuff off. Full screen on the one thing I'm concentrated on, making sure that my screen's at the right height. There's some interesting research out of the Huberman lab about the orientation of our eyes influencing our alertness, and I've actually found that effect myself. So I'm not on a laptop down here, I'm actually looking up. And so modify my environment, and then kind of psychologically, it's really about identifying those priorities. Just what is the one thing that I'm going to focus on now, and what is the outcome I'm trying to achieve, and just zoom in on that. And then of course, Pomodoro technique, 90-minute block of Pomodoros in the peak period of my day, which for me generally is kind of probably about a couple of hours after I wake up, and then lock in and just try and get that great work done. And generally it works. When it doesn't, I try not to beat myself up too much about it.
Book which has most impacted your life and how you show up to it.
That's a curveball.
Yeah, I had to leave you with something like this is like a classic knuckleball, right? It can move all over the place. So if you have one or two, or maybe even a handful, it's okay too.
Yeah, I think like one of the most influential psychology, kind of popular psychology books was when I read Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And the dual process of the mind, that kind of model has obviously got massive limitations. And again, it's a heuristic. But it was very practical. It really opened up my mind to some different ways of thinking, particularly when I was starting to get more into looking at psychology, not just physiology. So that's a really big one there. So this idea of Anti-Fragile by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, it wasn't so much the detail of that book, just this idea that there was something beyond resilience, that actually in the right conditions, challenge and uncertainty can create opportunities for growth. And so that really resonated with me, this idea of anti-fragility. So there are a couple, and unfortunately, often I end up spending a lot of time just reading journal articles, loads of them. So this is why sometimes I struggle with popular books, because I'm just like, when was the last time I actually sat down and read a popular book cover to cover? It's quite a long time ago. Most of the time I'm kind of stuck in PubMed, kind of looking around to see what I can find.
Very cool. James, this has been a very inspiring conversation for me, and I know that it's going to be for everybody listening to this podcast. So thank you for taking the time. But if people want to find out more about you and what you're up to, where should we direct them to?
So I've got a website, and so that's jameshewittperformance.com. And would love it if you're interested, if you sign up to the newsletter on there. I push out a weekly newsletter kind of with all kinds of ideas and stuff I've found. So would really appreciate it if you're interested to give that a go. There's also an online course there as well, an academy sharing some of the ideas that I talked about today. But then also there's a new company which we're working on, which is trying to operationalize some of this science in terms of detecting when you're at your best. when you're stressed, helping people to identify and overcome kind of their leading causes of stress and schedule their time in relation to that. That's a company called optivio.com. It's not available to the public yet, but again, there's a waiting list. And really appreciate the opportunity to plug that, because I know that's not the main intention of this podcast, but they're the two main places. And obviously, usual suspects. You can find me on LinkedIn, on Twitter, James P. Hewitt. Haven't got many followers. I really struggle to find the time to engage with social media, but I do put some stuff out there, which people can find. But yeah, and we'd really welcome the opportunity to connect with people. If they've got questions, there's stuff they wanted to follow up on, they want to challenge me on, there's stuff that people think I might be interested in. It's such an amazing source, isn't it, of knowledge and ideas, and would really welcome the opportunity to connect with some of your listeners.
Absolutely. And I highly recommend the newsletter. It's very thoughtful, James, and it really targets what we've been talking about today quite a bit. So again,
Thanks.
I'll link to all of this in the show notes for everybody tuning in here. And James, thank you for the time today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
To all the listeners out there, have an absolutely epic day.